The snow came early to the Peace River country that October, the kind that didn't wait for permission, that buried the road to Grimshaw under 3 feet of white, and made the world feel like it had sealed itself shut. Agnes Merritt had learned to read weather the way other women read faces, quickly, without sentiment, and always with one eye on the exit. She was standing outside the land office in Manning, her travel bag at her feet, watching a man she'd never met climb down from a wagon. He moved like someone who'd been working too hard for too long. Careful with his knees, deliberate with his footing, like the ground couldn't be trusted. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. His coat was good once. It wasn't anymore. He looked at her the way you'd look at a fence post you weren't sure would hold. Behind her, inside the office, Gerald Pruitt was already counting the money. He'd been her father's business partner once, before the debt swallowed everything. After her father died, Pruitt had come to her with what he called a solution. A rancher up north needed someone to keep house and help with his 2 children. He'd pay Pruitt a finder's fee. Agnes would get a roof, a wage, and a way out of the boarding house where she'd been sleeping on a cot behind the kitchen since spring. She was 23 years old. She didn't have better options. Miss Merritt, Pruitt had said, smoothing the paperwork on his desk. Leonard Holt is a decent man. Widower. Owns land up past the Peace River. He needs someone capable, not someone soft. Agnes hadn't asked what that meant. She'd learned that when men said not someone soft, they meant someone who wouldn't complain. The rancher, Leonard Holt, crossed the frozen mud toward her without hurrying. Up close, his eyes were the flat gray of a November sky. He didn't offer his hand. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "You're later than I expected," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a reaction, more like the absence of one, held deliberately. "Truck's around the corner. You got more bags?" "Just the one." He picked it up without asking and walked toward the corner. Agnes followed, her boots crunching through ice that had formed overnight in the ruts. She didn't look back at Pruitt. There was nothing there she needed to see. The drive north took almost 4 hours. Leonard Holt didn't speak. The radio in the truck didn't work. Agnes watched the birch trees slide past and tried to remember the last time she'd been this far from anything. "What are their names?" she said, somewhere past the 2nd hour. His hands tightened on the wheel. "Whose names?" "Your children." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Walter, he's 12, and Della, she's 8, and their mother, 2 years ago." The words came out flat, like he'd had to practice making them that way. "Fever." Agnes nodded and didn't ask anything more. The silence stretched back between them like a road with no end. The ranch appeared out of the snow like something that had been waiting there forever, stubborn and gray, and unwilling to apologize for itself. A main house, a barn, a cluster of outbuildings, all leaning slightly into the same wind. Smoke came from the chimney, thin and pale. The fence along the drive needed mending. The yard needed everything. Leonard pulled the truck up to the porch and got out. Agnes sat for a moment, looking at the house through the frost on the window. 2 faces were watching her from behind the glass. She couldn't make out their expressions. She got out. The cold hit her with the full weight of the north, and she pulled her coat tighter and walked to the door. Leonard was already inside, stomping snow from his boots. Agnes stepped in behind him and felt the heat and the smell of the place all at once. Wood smoke, something on the stove, wet wool drying by the fire. The children stood in the middle of the room. The boy, Walter, was tall for 12, with his father's square jaw and dark hair and an expression that said he'd already decided something about her. The girl, Della, was smaller, with pale hair twisted into 2 uneven braids and eyes so large they looked borrowed from someone else's face. She was clutching a stuffed rabbit that had lost most of one ear. Nobody moved. "Hello," Agnes said. Walter's chin lifted. "We don't need a housekeeper, that's all right," Agnes said. "I'm not much of one." He blinked. It wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. Leonard's voice came from behind her, flat and tired. "Walter, take her bag to the back room. Pa, now." Walter's mouth pressed into a line. He picked up her bag without looking at her and disappeared down the hall. A door closed, not quite a slam. Della watched her brother go, then looked back at Agnes with those enormous eyes. "Is the rabbit's name secret?" Agnes asked. Della looked down at the stuffed animal. "Edmund," she said, very quietly. "That's a good name." Della didn't say anything else, but she didn't run away either. Leonard crossed to the stove and lifted the lid on a pot. "Supper's at 6. Mornings start early." "How early?" "Early." That was all she got. Agnes found her room at the end of the hall, barely enough for a cot and a dresser, a window that looked out onto the woodpile and the tree line beyond. The walls were plain wood. The floor was cold even through her socks. She sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the sounds of the house. The fire ticking in the main room, the wind finding the gaps in the siding. Someone, Della, she thought, moving quietly overhead. It wasn't much. But it was more than the boarding house cot, and at least here no one would ask her to smile. She woke before anyone else. The fire had burned down, and the house was cold enough that her breath showed in the dark. Agnes, dressed by feel, went to the main room and rebuilt the fire with the wood stacked beside the hearth. When the flames caught, she found the kitchen and the supplies and started breakfast. By the time the light turned gray at the windows, she had oatmeal on the stove, bacon in the pan, and biscuits in the oven. She'd had to work for a solid 15 minutes before she understood how it operated. The children came out one at a time. Della first, still carrying Edmund, then Walter, dressed and scowling. They sat at the table without being asked and looked at the food like it might be a trick. Leonard came in from outside. He'd already been out to the barn and stopped in the doorway. Snow dusted his shoulders. He looked at the table, at the food, at Agnes standing by the stove. He didn't say anything. He sat down. "You didn't have to do this," Walter said, not quite looking at her. "I know," Agnes said. "Then why did you?" She set a plate in front of him. "Because it's cold and you're 12 years old and oatmeal is the least I can do." Walter looked at the oatmeal. Then he picked up his spoon. The days built on each other the way snow builds, one layer at a time, each one thin on its own, until you looked up and couldn't see the ground anymore. Agnes woke before dawn, kept the fire, made meals, hauled water when the tap in the kitchen froze, which was often, mended what needed mending, learned which floorboards would wake the children if she stepped wrong in the night, learned that Della liked her oatmeal, with extra brown sugar, and Walter pretended not to but always finished Della's if she left any. She learned that Leonard Holt came in from the barn every evening at the same time, and stood at the kitchen door for a moment before coming inside, like he was preparing himself for something. She didn't know what. She didn't ask. Walter was the harder one. He watched her the way a dog watches a stranger at the gate, not ready to bite, not ready to wag his tail, just watching. He did his chores without being asked and his schoolwork without complaint, and stayed out of her way with a deliberateness that felt almost polite. One morning she found him out behind the barn, trying to fix a split rail on his own with tools too heavy for his hands. She stood back for a minute watching before she said anything. "I can hold the other end," she said. He looked at her, looked at the rail. "I've done it before." "I know. I'm just standing here." He thought about it. Then he moved over slightly, which she took as permission. They worked in silence, breath coming in clouds in the cold until the rail was back in its post. When it was done, Walter tested it with his shoulder, then nodded once, the way she'd seen Leonard nod when something came out right. He went back inside without a word. But the next morning he left a cup of coffee on the counter beside the stove at the exact height she'd need to reach for it first thing, and she understood. Della was different. Della was quiet in a way that wasn't shyness. Exactly. She moved through the house like she was conserving something, like sound and energy were things she had a limited supply of and needed to spend carefully. She didn't ignore Agnes. She watched her, steadily and without apology, the way children watch things they're trying to understand. Agnes had been there 3 weeks when she woke to crying in the night, not loud, more like the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard. She followed it to Della's door, which was open a crack. Della was sitting up in bed, Edmund pressed to her chest, tears running silently down her face. "Can I come in?" Agnes asked. Della looked at her for a moment. Then she moved over slightly on the bed. Agnes sat down. The room was cold. She could feel it through her wool socks. "Bad dream?" Della shook her head. "What then?" A long pause. "I was trying to remember her voice," Della said finally. "Mama's voice. And I couldn't." Agnes's chest tightened. She didn't reach out immediately. She just sat with it for a moment, the way you had to sit with certain kinds of hurt before you could do anything useful with them. "I lost my mother when I was 19, she said. "Not the same as you. But I know what it's like when you reach for the memory and it isn't where you left it." Della stared at her. "Does it get better?" Agnes thought about lying, decided against it. "It gets different. You remember other things. The way she smelled. The sound of her moving around the kitchen in the morning. Those things stay longer than the voice does, usually." Della was quiet. Then slowly she leaned sideways until her head was resting against Agnes's arm. Agnes put her arm around the small, bony shoulders and held on. She stayed until Della's breathing slowed and steadied, then carried her back down to the pillow and tucked Edmund in beside her. Della's hand caught her sleeve before she could move away. "Stay," she whispered. Agnes stayed. The cold deepened through November. Leonard worked from before light until after dark, coming in hollow-eyed and tight-jawed. He said little. He ate what was put in front of him. He watched his children with a quietness that Agnes had started to recognize as love, the wordless, practical kind that showed up as mended boots and extra wood by the door. She noticed things. She couldn't help it. The way he'd rebuilt the shelves in the pantry without being asked, because she'd mentioned once that they were uneven. The way he'd left a heavier coat on the hook by the back door after he saw her shivering on the porch. The coat was too big for her and smelled like cedar and engine oil, and she wore it anyway. They didn't talk about any of it. There was an unspoken agreement, she thought, to let things be what they were without naming them. Then Della got sick. It started as a cold, which she'd had before and gotten through. But by the second day, her temperature was high enough that it scared Agnes. And by the third day, Della couldn't keep anything down and wouldn't wake up properly, and just lay in her bed with her eyes not quite focused, and Edmund pressed against her face. Leonard rode out for the doctor. The roads were iced over, and he was back in 2 hours without one, his face gray. Doctor's out past Rycroft. Earliest he can get here is tomorrow. Agnes was already in Della's room with a basin of cool water and everything she could remember her own mother doing during a fever. She sponged Della's forehead and got broth into her, a spoonful at a time, even when Della turned her face away, talked to her in a low voice about nothing in particular, kept the room from getting too hot or too cold, sat through the long dark hours when the fever climbed, and Della called out for someone she couldn't have. Walter appeared in the doorway near midnight. He was still dressed. He'd been awake this whole time. Is she going to be okay? His voice was careful, like he was afraid of what the air might do with it. Agnes looked at him steadily. Yes, you don't know that. No, but I'm not going to let anything else happen. He stood there a moment longer. His jaw was working. He was so much older than 12 in that moment that it hurt to look at him. She's all I've got left, he said. I know. Agnes held his gaze. Go sleep, Walter. I've got her, he went, but he left his bedroom door open for the first time since Agnes had arrived. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. Della opened her eyes, clear and present, and said in a thin voice that she was thirsty. Agnes put her hands over her face for a moment before she went to get the water. When Leonard came to check on them that morning, he stood in the doorway of Della's room looking at his daughter, who was propped up against the pillow drinking from a cup and chattering weakly about Edmund, and Agnes saw his shoulders drop 2 inches in the space of a single exhale. He looked at Agnes. His throat moved. You stayed up the whole time, he said. Mostly. You should have gotten me. You needed to sleep. The barn doesn't run itself. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said, and it came out rougher than he probably intended, like the words had been scraped over something on the way out. Agnes just nodded and went to put the kettle on. After that, the house felt different. Not warmer, exactly. The cold was built into the walls. That wouldn't change until spring, but less sealed off. Della stopped measuring her words so carefully. She sat with Agnes in the kitchen in the afternoons and talked about her teacher and what she wanted to plant in the garden when the ground thawed, and whether Edmund needed a friend. Walter helped with chores without being asked and started leaving his school books on the kitchen table in the evenings so Agnes could help him if he got stuck, though he never asked directly. Leonard lingered longer after supper. Not much, but enough. One evening Agnes was mending a pair of Walter's work pants by the fire when Leonard came and sat in the other chair, a thing he'd never done before, always taking the table or standing near the door. He had a piece of harness leather he was working on. They sat in silence for a while, which wasn't unusual, except that this silence felt different from the others. Can I ask you something? Leonard said. Sure. Why did Pruitt send you here? Agnes set the pants in her lap. He said you needed someone capable. That's not what I meant. Leonard's hands paused on the leather. I mean, what was he getting out of it? She looked at him steadily. Money. My father owed him. I didn't have the means to pay it back. This was his solution. Leonard's jaw tightened. So he sold you. He called it an arrangement. That's the same thing. Yes, Agnes said. It is. The fire settled. Outside, the wind had picked up, finding the north side of the house. Did he hurt you? Leonard asked. Quiet, but with something underneath it. Not physically. But there's more than one way to be hurt by someone who's supposed to be looking out for you. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You deserved better than what he did. Agnes looked at the mending in her hands. Maybe, but I'm not sure I would have ended up here otherwise. And here, she stopped. What? She chose her words. It's the first place in a long time that feels worth staying. Leonard didn't answer, but when she glanced up, he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not quite surprise. More like someone recognizing something they'd given up looking for. He went back to the harness. Agnes went back to the mending. They sat there until the fire burned low, and neither of them said anything more, and it was the most at ease. Agnes had felt in longer than she could properly remember. February came in mean and relentless. The snow piled past the first rail of every fence on the property, and Leonard was out breaking trail every morning before the children were awake. Agnes kept things running inside, kept the meals coming, and the wood box full, and Della from worrying herself into another illness about whether the horses were warm enough. Then a man named Doug Harker came to the house. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Leonard was out with the cattle. Agnes answered the door to find a man in a good coat standing on the porch, polite-faced and watchful, who introduced himself as a land agent out of Edmonton. "I'm here to see Mr. Holt," he said, "about a purchase offer on the property." Agnes felt something tighten in her chest. "He's not here." "I'll wait," Harker said pleasantly, and before she could properly decide against it, he was standing in the front room. Leonard came in an hour later and went gray when he saw Harker. The conversation happened at the kitchen table, and Agnes stayed. She told herself to give them tea, but really, she just couldn't make herself go. The offer was real, substantial. Harker had papers with numbers on them that Agnes could read from across the table, and they were enough to make her stomach sink. When Harker finally left, Leonard sat at the table alone for a long time. Agnes poured him coffee and sat across from him. "How bad is it?" He looked up. The question had surprised him. "What? The ranch? How bad is it?" He exhaled slowly. "Bad enough that the number he put on paper is hard to argue with. Last 2 winters. The price of feed. The vet bills when we lost half the calves in March." He put his hands flat on the table. "I've been managing." "But managing isn't the same as being all right?" "No," Agnes said. "It's not." She sat with it for a moment. Then, "What do Della and Walter know?" "Nothing. They should know something. Not the numbers, but that things are tight. Children handle things better when they're not surprised by them." Leonard's mouth pressed together. "I don't want them worrying. They're already worrying. They just don't know what about." He looked at her for a long moment, then he picked up his coffee. Agnes sat across from him in the quiet and tried to think. She had 4 months of wages saved, not much. But she started, over the following weeks, to take in mending from the families in town. She mentioned it to Leonard as though it were nothing in particular, just something to keep her hands busy. He didn't argue, but he looked at her with an expression that was becoming familiar. Like he wasn't sure what to do with what she kept turning out to be. Della and Walter took it in stride, in the way children do when they trust the adults around them more than they've been given reason to. Walter started helping Agnes sort the mending orders in the evenings. Della drew small pictures on the paper Agnes used to wrap the finished work and insisted they improved things. The debt did not disappear, but it stopped growing, and that was something. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did up north, through mud and flooding and the insistence of crows. Agnes started a kitchen garden as soon as the ground softened enough to work. Della helped plant peas and carrots in rows that weren't entirely straight, and announced that Edmund was supervising, and Agnes led her. One afternoon, Agnes was out at the far edge of the garden when she heard Leonard's voice, and then another voice she didn't recognize, low, male, with a tone that made the hair on her neck stand up. She moved closer and heard the other man say, "People talk, Holt. You know they do. Woman living out here, no family, no ring, doesn't look right." She stopped moving. Leonard's voice was flat. "What happens on my property is no concern of anyone else's. Your children go to school in town," the man said. "People notice things." She heard Leonard say something she didn't catch, and then the other voice moved away, and a truck started and drove off. Agnes stood very still in the mud between the pea seedlings. She didn't go inside right away. She stood there until the sound of the truck was gone, turning the words over. People notice. Doesn't look right. She'd known this was coming. Had known it since the first week probably, and had found it easier not to think about. The problem wasn't what people thought of her. She had learned to care very little about that. The problem was what it might do to Della and Walter, and to Leonard's standing in a community he had to live in after Agnes was gone, and she would be gone eventually. That was the shape of the arrangement, whether anyone had said it plainly or not. That night, after the children were in bed, she told Leonard what she'd heard. He didn't seem surprised. He stood by the window with his arms crossed. "Who was that?" she asked. "Harker's associate." His voice was controlled. "Harker's been talking in town since I turned down his offer." Agnes sat at the table. "He's not entirely wrong. He's wrong enough, Leonard." She waited until he turned to look at her. "I'm living in your house, unmarried, no legal connection to you or the children. In a town like this, that's enough for people to use against you, especially if Harker wants to make things difficult." Leonard's jaw worked. "I don't care what Harker wants. I know you don't. But Della will hear things at school. Walter will get into fights. You know that." The silence between them was different from the usual kind. This one had edges. "So what are you saying?" Leonard said finally. Agnes looked at her hands. "I'm saying that maybe I should think about going back to Manning. Find other work. Take the pressure off." "No." The word came out before she'd finished speaking. Agnes looked up. Leonard was watching her. The muscle in his jaw was working. He looked like a man who'd been working up to something for a long time, and had just been pushed past the point of putting it off. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Leonard, I mean it." He came away from the window and sat down across from her, elbows on the table, like he needed the distance closed before he could say what he was going to say. I don't do this well, saying things. You know that, I know, but you need to hear it. He stopped, tried again. When Margaret died, I thought that was the end of anything that wasn't just surviving. Getting the children to the next year, keeping the ranch from going under. His voice was level, but only barely. And then you came, and you made Della laugh again. You made Walter trust someone. You made this house feel like it had something going on inside it besides just holding on. Agnes's chest ached. I'm not asking you to be Margaret, he said. I'm not built that way, and I don't think you'd want to be. I'm asking you to stay, as my wife, if you'll have me. Not because of what Harker says or what people in town are talking about. He held her eyes. Because I want you here. And because somewhere in the last 6 months I went from needing help to needing you, and I should have said it sooner. Agnes was very quiet for a moment. I'm not easy to be around, she said finally. Neither am I. I have opinions about how things should be done. I've noticed. And I'm not leaving them at the door when I move in properly. Good. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close. I don't want someone who'll disappear into the walls. I've got enough quiet as it is. Agnes looked at him for a long time. At the lines around his eyes, at the hands flat on the table, at the man who'd been carrying all of this for 2 years without once asking anyone for help. Yes, she said. He exhaled, slow and long, like he'd been holding his breath for months. They told the children the next morning over breakfast. Della went absolutely still for 3 seconds, and then launched herself off her chair and into Agnes's arms with enough force to knock the breath out of her. Walter sat with his fork halfway to his mouth and didn't move for a moment, then set it down and looked at his father. About time, he said. Leonard gave him a look. Walter gave it right back, and there was something in that exchange. Something passed between them like a handshake, or maybe an acknowledgement, that made Agnes have to look away at the window until she had her face sorted out. The wedding was small, done at the church in Manning on a Thursday in early April, with mud still on the road and the birches just starting to show the first pale green at the tips of their branches. The minister was a compact, cheerful man who kept the ceremony brief and warm. There were a dozen people in the pews, neighbors, the family who ran the feed store, Mrs. Atwood, who ran the post office and had been leaving extra cookies in the mail slot since October. Della wore her yellow dress and had given Edmund a small bow tie made from a piece of ribbon. Walter stood beside his father in a shirt that was already getting short in the sleeves and didn't fidget once. Leonard's hands were steady when he took hers. His voice wasn't, quite. Agnes's voice was steadier than she would have expected, which she thought might say something about her, and she wasn't sure what. When the minister said what needed saying and Leonard put a simple band on her finger, Della made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a cheer and managed to be both at once. On the drive home, the children fell asleep in the back seat. Leonard drove with one hand on the wheel. Agnes watched the tree line go by and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time settle into her chest. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something quieter and more durable. Something like yes. Summer came in hard and warm and generous, the way Peace River summers could be when they decided to make up for the winters. The garden grew. The cattle put on weight. Della learned to swim in the shallows of the river down past the fence line, and Walter started helping Leonard with the heavier work in a way that wasn't a boy helping anymore. Agnes took her mending business to 2 days a week in town and put the money in a tin on the high shelf she'd claimed as hers, and nobody touched it. One evening in August, Leonard and Agnes sat on the porch after the children had gone inside. The sky was doing something extraordinary, the way it did up here, going from orange to purple to a green that had no business being in a sky. Agnes had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. I want to tell you something, Leonard said. All right. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. When Harker came last February, first thing I thought wasn't about the money, or what it would mean to leave. Agnes waited. First thing I thought was whether you'd come with us. If I took the offer and we had to go somewhere else. He glanced at her. That was the moment I understood what was actually happening. Agnes looked at him. What do you mean? I mean you'd stopped being someone I'd hired and started being something that mattered. He paused. Someone I'd reorganize everything around if I had to. Agnes set her cup down on the railing and said nothing for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held on, and they sat like that while the sky went through all its colors, and the nighthawks came out over the field and the lights from the house threw long, warm squares across the porch boards. There were hard years still ahead. There would be bad winters and tight money and mornings when the weight of everything was almost more than could be borne. There would be fights. Real ones, the kind that come from two people with opinions living in close quarters. And there would be moments of loss that couldn't be argued with or fixed. But there would also be Della, who grew into a girl who laughed easily, and kept Edmund on a shelf in her room until she left for university, and who could name every plant in the kitchen garden by the time she was 10. And Walter, who became by degrees a young man who worked hard and listened more than he spoke, and had his father's hands and his own stubborn, quiet heart. And there would be this, the porch in August, the sky doing its impossible thing above the Peace River, two people who had each come to this place broken in ways they couldn't fully name, finding that what they'd built between them was stronger than what had broken them. Agnes had come north with one bag and nothing in it worth keeping. She left nothing. She stayed. And in the end, that was how a life began. Not with the moment you arrived, but with the moment you stopped waiting for something to go wrong and put your hands in the earth and said, "Hear this, I'm staying here."